Thank you so much, and I'm so happy to be here and so grateful for Jonathan for inviting me to share some of my experiences with all of you and think about how we actually achieve sustainability with and without technology. I also want to say I think it's completely unfair that I have to follow the dancers because that was extraordinarily exciting and beautiful, and I'm not so sure I'm going to meet the measure, but I hope that I will do an okay job. One of the things I want to talk to you a little bit about, first off, is so I work for the Worldwide Fund for Nature. The Worldwide Fund for Nature has as its logo the panda, and many of you will recognize that. And so some of you may be asking, why is the chief scientist for Worldwide Fund for Nature talking about sustainability? And the reason is we do a lot more than just save threatened species. We actually work to make sure that the Earth is inhabitable and we're staying within our life support systems for all species, including humans. So sustainable development is very much at the core of what we do and is becoming even more so, particularly as we move through this next decade, which is critically important for all of us, not just for tigers, not just for elephants, not just for rhinos, but for humans. And I'm hoping that I can set out the challenge enough so that you can understand that you all have a role to play, technology has a role to play, and new innovation has a role to play in solving this challenge. Let me just say that in the Sustainable Development Goals that were approved and signed on to in 2015, they intended to set a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. And that means absolutely everyone on the planet. To do so, they are intended to address global challenges we face, including those related to poverty, inequality, climate, environmental degradation, prosperity, peace, and justice. And here I have highlighted in bold both climate and environmental degradation, because I want to make the point, and I'm not sure it's not always understood. This is the first time that a development agenda, a human development agenda, had at its core and at its basis both climate regulation and environmental health. It's the first time that we understood that we can't meet the needs of humans across the planet if we don't protect and safeguard nature. And that's critical to why I'm talking about this today. So a major change in the way we think about the connection between development and environment is why I'm here today. The development goals, and there are 17 of them, and sometimes it's mind-boggling to think about all 17 of them all together, often some of them counteracting one another. But it's a plan to build a better world for people and the planet by 2030 by promoting prosperity while protecting the environment. And if you think about the way we do business on the planet today, to have just 15 years to get to a sustainable place on the planet, the challenge is massive, and it's going to take all of us and all our innovation to determine how we're actually going to achieve these goals. There's no blueprint. There really, truly is no blueprint. So one of the things I think that is also important that was produced by the Stockholm Resilience Center is they took those sustainable development goals, all 17 of them, and they put them into a wedding cake. And this wedding cake was a depiction of the Sustainable Development Goals and has as its base, the base of the wedding cake is the environmental goals. And it's intended to show the need for a steep transition to a world where society operates within the limits, planetary boundary limits for planetary health and for the health of people. So I want to point out to you that this includes climate action, Sustainable Development Goal 13. It includes life below water, primarily the ocean, but also rivers, in Sustainable Development Goal 14. Number 15 is life on land, all land. And then number 6 is clean water and sanitation. And we often think of that you can meet some of these development goals through man-made infrastructure. But often the most efficient way to do that is to think about how you actually make use and harness the natural processes that Mother Earth has already given us. So let's look at these 4 Sustainable Development Goals that have nature at the center of them. I'm going to focus first on climate. From a policy perspective, we have the 2015 Paris Agreement to keep a global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5. This is an incredibly ambitious goal, And the mechanism to do that is through nationally determined contributions. So each nation on the planet determines how they're going to help achieve this global goal. Well, how are we doing on that? Can we look at this really, really seriously? There is an enormous gap between what we need to do and what we're actually doing to prevent dangerous levels of climate change. And this comes from the UN Environment 2018 Emissions Gap Report. And we're not doing any better. So we know we need to do something about climate change, but there's still a huge gap between what we're doing and what we need to do. We need innovation here. Let's look at the other 3 that come together in a block as well. When the Sustainable Development Goals were developed, they took the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which is kind of nature's convention, and took those targets and put them right under the Sustainable Development Goal targets. So they just adopted the 2010 Aichi targets. So the Aichi targets are many. There's 20 of them. And these are the targets that underpin the Sustainable Development Goals. But how is it possible that a set of goals that were determined in 2010 could actually truly be designed to deliver on sustainable development for people? The problem is they don't. And so we have to ask ourselves, are these targets fit for purpose? And are they fit for purpose? And are we even meeting these targets that aren't fit for purpose? And the answer is no. So November 21st, 2018, there was an updated assessment on progress towards the goals. And for most of the Aichi biodiversity targets, there's been limited progress, and for some targets, no progress at all. So if we're truly to think about nature as underpinning the Sustainable Development Goals in climate, water, oceans, and the clean water, we're a little bit in trouble. So I want to ask then, is it because we don't have the science we need? So I'm the chief scientist, so I always think that the best answer is a little bit more research. Wouldn't a little bit more research give us the roadmap on what we need to do? And I'll tell you, for climate, let's look at the climate target alone. We actually know that CO2 emissions are rising. I think that this is not a problem for us. The science is fixed. We know what the problem is. We actually even know what to do about it. A lot of our efforts have been focused on mitigation through energy emissions reductions. But we lack the political will to actually implement them. That we need innovation in this field, in this area. We need innovation to create the political will to actually implement what we already know needs to be done and where the science is really clear. I'll tell you, on one thing that hasn't gotten as much attention is the role of nature in actually modifying the climate and helping us adapt to climate change. And you'll hear a lot more as we go into the UN General Assembly next week about the focus on nature-based solutions, or the way nature can help us mitigate climate and adapt to the impacts of climate. Such things such as stopping global deforestation or reforestation, or even putting efforts into rebuilding our soils for agriculture again. So we know what to do on climate. We need the political will. It's not the science. What about for the other three Sustainable Development Goals that underpin human development? There was just a 2019, some of you may have missed it, in May. There's a 2019 UN report by IPBES. It's the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, but I'm just going to call it the 2019 UN Environmental Report because that's a mouthful. It's a report that said we actually really need to focus on nature, the non-human world with living organisms and their diversity. But at the same time, when nature is whole and it's working well, we need to recognize that nature contributes a whole lot to human well-being. And this report systematically went through the ways in which nature contributes to human well-being. And I think that most of you probably know these, and you probably think about it intuitively, but when you see it as a set, it becomes really clear that we need to be better at protecting nature, our life support system. It goes on from things that you would think about the World Wildlife Fund really caring about, which is habitat creation and maintenance. After all, it is habitat that creates the home for all of the species on the planet. But it's also pollination, pollinating some very important nutritional crops that are going to be critical for us in the future. It includes the regulation of freshwater flow. It includes the regulation of hazards and extreme events, particularly on the coast. So coral reefs can often help in modifying the impact of extreme storms. It also includes medicinal, biochemical, genetic resources. So there's a whole array of benefits we get from nature, and we are systematically undermining it as if we don't actually depend on those benefits, and we do. So is the science lacking on this? I would say the science is under construction. I think we know it's important, but it's not like where we are in climate, where we actually know exactly what we need to do in climate. We know what the global targets are. We know exactly what each of our industries need to do. We know how we need to act together to make it happen. But it's not true with nature, because nature acts to provide benefits for humans at all scales, at the global scale, at the regional scale, water delivery, and also at the local scale, pollination services and the lot. So targets to underpin human well-being need to be developed at the global, regional, and local scale, so the nations of the world actually need to know what they need to do to actually conserve nature that underpins human well-being. And we need to act fast with the assessments and safeguard the Earth's natural life support systems. So the science is clear, but the science isn't super clear about the targets we need to set at all these scales. And that's a really important point. So what about the policy targets? One of the things I think that's really important for us to think about is that when you have a very separate climate agreement and you implement it very separately, and you have a very separate nature agreement and you implement it separately, and you have a very separate human development agreement and you implement it separately, you have these three things moving forward undermining one another systematically over and over again. You have roads being built through wetlands that are critical nursery habitats for fish. You have the destruction of a reef system where we depend on fish. So it's really important that we take these together and implement them together. So moving forward into 2020, and this UNGA, the UN General Assembly meeting in New York next week is critically important for beginning to build an agenda, an integrated agenda for nature and people in 2020, where we link the Sustainable Development Goals more explicitly with what we're trying to achieve in climate, more explicitly with what we're trying to achieve with the Convention on Biological Diversity and the conservation of nature. And one of the movements that has arisen in the last year to actually meet that challenge is the movement called the Deal for Nature and People. This is a recognition that we are inextricably linked, and if we see these as separate, we will fail. If we see them as together and we begin to implement them together, we have a chance of succeeding. So we want to protect and restore nature by 2030 for benefit of people and for nature. The agenda says then by 2030, and this means by 100% sustainability by 2050, but 2030 is an incredibly important marker. We want to be able to provide food for 9 billion people. We want to be able to have water for 9 billion people. We want the diversity of life on the planet. No one wants to give up the diversity of life on this earth. Certainly not the rhinos, certainly not the elephants and other important species. We absolutely need a stable climate. When people talk about a climate crisis, we are experiencing it, and we know what the science is. We need to act on that, and we need inclusive, healthy communities that are able to act in concert to deliver global outcomes. So what does that look like? It means that 50% of the planet by 2030 needs to be protected, restored, or sustainably managed. What does that look like? That's not for me to decide. It's not for the World Wild Fund for Nature to decide either. It's really for us to decide as a people in ways that are inclusive and healthy for communities across the globe. We also need a 50% reduction in the impact of unsustainable production and consumption. This means that the nations of the world that consume too much need to really look at their consumption patterns and begin to get those in line with a sustainable planet. And this is not something we're talking about in an open kind of way. And we really need to start about what does it look like to have a sustainable planet for all. And we need to make sure that we have zero extinction of threatened species. So you can see in these kinds of targets, this isn't just a climate target. These aren't just a target for human development. It's not just a target for biodiversity and for the protection of species. These are targets for an entire planet, a sustainable planet in the future. We are working closely with governments of the world, with our NGO partners of the world, with corporations, with finance partners in developing how we actually do this. So the answers, we don't have all the answers yet, but we do invite you to think about joining the Deal for Nature and People and think about what innovation you can bring to the table to deliver a sustainable planet for safeguarding both human health and natural systems that underpin it. Thank you.